Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the DXM podcast. I am Colborn Bell. I am joined today by artist Amir H. Fallah. Amir, it's a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We start in the same place, but we don't always go the same places, and that would be to ask you about yourself, anything you'd like to share, and how you came to be involved with NFTs.
Yeah, well, yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm primarily a painter, although I do all sorts of things just this past year, I've done stained glass works, sculptures in bronze, aluminum, all sorts of things. So I don't really limit myself as far as like material or medium. I just go wherever my interests lie. But yeah, I come from the contemporary art world. Although there is a unique kind of element to my story where while I was going to art school, I got into graphic design because I started publishing an art and design magazine called Beautiful Decay. So I ended up teaching myself graphic design and did that professionally, both for my own company and then also for museums and galleries and all sorts of businesses, as essentially as a day job for well over a decade. So I have a lot of experience in the design world and also in the illustration world. I used to hire a lot of photographers, designers, illustrators for my publication and clothing line. So I have a lot of experience in that world. So all of that to say, in late 2020, I had a couple of collectors of mine who collect my work, my physical work. They came to me and said, "Hey, there's this new thing called the NFT. Have you ever heard of it?" And I had no idea what it was. I had barely heard of crypto, and I knew what Bitcoin was, but that was about it. And both of these guys were heavily, invested in crypto, and through crypto they got into NFTs. And they said, "You should look into it. We think your work would do really well with it. It's really exciting." I've always had an interest in things that are on the fringes or more experimental. My magazine kind of came out of that. And so I started researching it, and the more I looked into it, I got the concept immediately, because I worked with so many designers and illustrators and people that made digital work, whether it was like video or animations or GIFs that couldn't monetize it. And I was like, oh, this is a great way to monetize that work and actually sell it and collect it. And so, yeah, I released my first piece on Super Rare, which my collector friends, they kind of helped facilitate that relationship. And it did well. And, next thing I know, I'm like down the rabbit hole. And, the more you get into it, the more interesting it gets. And here I am almost, 2.5 years later. And yeah, and I feel like I'm still pretty heavily involved. And there's not, there's very few people from the contemporary art world that are actually involved on like a day-to-day basis. There's a lot of people that kind of come and release a project, try to maybe cash in, or like they experiment with it and then they're like, this isn't for me, or, they leave. But for whatever reason, I've been really interested in it and keep continuing to release things and just take part in the community.
Yeah, maybe we can talk about just more specifically those points of interest that even through kind of like this crazy hype cycle have kind of grounded you and kept you here.
Yeah, like I said, I've always been interested in things on the fringes, and things that are experimental. So the way I got into contemporary art was through graffiti. I was a graffiti writer. I started taking art classes to get better at graffiti, essentially. And then I realized, I love art. And then And then my magazine was one of the first magazines to ever cover, what turned into street art. We actually used to, in the early 2000s, we had a section called public art, because the term street art didn't exist. But it was like everything that was graffiti that didn't fit into like the traditional, framework of like American graffiti, which is like focused on letters. So I've always been kind of interested in these new things that are coming up. And so I think NFTs was just like an extension of that. And then also because I did a lot of design work, I felt very comfortable using a computer. I use Photoshop to create all my paintings. So I started exploring the idea of like, what would it mean if I made something that was a digital piece that only existed digitally? So I wasn't really a fan of taking a painting and selling like a digital version of it. That didn't really excite me at all, and it still doesn't excite me. But the idea of making something that's meant to be on a monitor, that's meant to be seen on a laptop or a phone, I find that really interesting, and trying to exploit that limitation, to create new types of work.
I mean, that's an analogy with graffiti that I haven't heard in a while. I think the earlier spirit of the artist was, now the public art of the streets is online, and this is kind of our way to just get it up there, get it out there, call it our art. So I think it makes sense ultimately that you would kind of come back around and be attracted to kind of the permissionless aspect of this.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of similarities between like the graffiti world and then later on the street art world, and the cycles that those markets have had in popularity and sales, and being embraced by collectors, and what's happening in NFTs. Like I almost feel like when I got involved in NFTs, like as things were happening, I was like, oh, I've been here before. I've been here when I was there when street art exploded, and all my friends who were like broke all of a sudden were printing money, and there was all these speculative collectors coming in and trying to cash in and like jacking up prices. So I'm middle aged. I'm 43 years old. So I've kind of been through a couple of cycles, just not necessarily in the NFT space, but I've seen a lot of these things, and I get a lot of flack because I'm fairly vocal on Twitter and in spaces about kind of the market side of things, and it's because I've just seen what's happened to my friends, both good and bad, in the street art world and graffiti art world, where they had these huge career booms and they were like printing money overnight. And many of them thought it was sustainable, but really it wasn't. And the ones that it was sustainable for, really, most of them got absorbed into the contemporary art world, because at the end of the day, they were just making art, just in like a niche part of the art world. And I see that happening with a lot of NFT artists, and that's why like Tyler Hobbs is like doing projects with Pace. It's kind of the same thing, just happening over and over again. But I think like 6 months ago, a lot of people would get mad when I would like point out these things. Like, you can't just keep selling stuff for millions of dollars when you've been making art for like a year. And now people are seeing how these kind of cycles work.
Well, I have to say the wisdom that you do publicly share is always, like, I think very well intentioned and very well guided, and it's very like welcomed and important, because so much of the time, obviously, Twitter just creates these echo chambers. And it does become just rather mindless. So, what would your advice be then for people who might have been kind of caught up in these cycles? I mean, just speaking to the artists in particular.
Well, I think the biggest thing is that if you're interested in art, if you're an artist, or whether you're an artist or a collector or an advocate, whatever it is, if you say you're interested in art, you should be interested in all types of art, because what's happening, the medium is really not that it's probably the least interesting thing. It's really like what you're saying and how you're using a visual language to communicate, and so that doesn't really that isn't categorized by medium. You know, like I never talk about like my oil paint or acrylic paint with some like endless fascination. It's not about the material; it's about what I'm doing with the material. And so, I would say go to galleries, go to museums. Like art has a long history for thousands of years that humans have added onto. And so you can't have generative art if you didn't have minimalist abstraction, you know? And if you couldn't have had minimalist abstraction if you didn't have what came before that. And what became before that, it's this lineage that's added onto. And again, I see the space changing a lot, and I see people kind of coming to this realization that everything's connected and nothing happens in a vacuum. But I think just like the contemporary art world needs to be more open to that concept of NFTs and digital artists. Younger digital artists have to be open to everything that came before them, because there are lessons to be learned both from the market side, but also from on a content side.
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty us versus them in the beginning. You know, there was almost a naivety and, you know, a willingness to kind of just disregard everything that came before. I think there has been an increased softness and you know, willingness on both sides to meet somewhere in the middle. I think, you know, the prevailing contemporary art world critique of NFTs is, oh, it was just a market innovation. Digital art was always here. Let's just use it to kind of sell what we know and who people know. And, you know, I think there is something interesting here, more digitally, perhaps native people that are beginning to kind of find their voice and their community. And do you have just kind of any thoughts on that? Do you think it is kind of bringing new artists up and into these worlds?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the one nice thing is it just makes art more accessible, and it makes artists sharing their work more accessible. And I think that's something to be celebrated, you know. And I also think, you know, like the thing that excites me with NFTs the most is that a lot of work that's digital but ephemeral, you know, can now be now there's something that people can feel excited about owning, you know. And I think that's only going to increase. So like if you're a performance artist, you know, now you can make an NFT of that performance and sell that, you know. Or if you're a video artist, like, you know, 10-15 years ago, I had a lot of friends that were video artists, and they used to try to make objects that went along with their videos as a way of like validating the video, because it was so hard to sell video art. And so I think NFTs have the potential to like solve that problem. Now, you know, there's limitations with time. You know, some people make very long video art, and, you know, you can't, there's platform limitations, but I think that's a temporary issue. But yeah, I just believe in being very open and curious. I think artists' number one job is to be curious. So I saw this new thing and I said, let me try it out. Let me see what I can do with it. And it took me about 4 or 5 months before I kind of like found what I wanted to do with it, which is very like rudimentary, and it's a very low tech approach to NFTs, what I do. But it feels sincere, and it feels like my own little space that I can explore that I can't do in paint or sculpture or, you know, installation or anything.
Yeah, will you talk more about the work that you do tokenize?
Yeah, so, you know, the first piece I made, which I started working on in January of 2021, but didn't actually mint till March of 2021. It was right after, I think I sold it right after the big Beeple sale. But so I made a painting, and I was asking a lot of questions about what does it mean to sell like a digitized version of a painting. And so I made this painting, an analog painting, and then I burned it, and I made a video piece of the piece burning. And the auction was to get the image of the burned piece and the video documenting it. So it was kind of questioning like which one's the original, what's authentic, and really it was also an homage to a famous work by John Baldessari, who is a professor of mine at UCLA, who famously, when he kind of declared that he was a conceptual artist, he took all of his prior paintings and set them on fire and cremated them, and then sold the ashes. So it was referencing many things, but that was kind of like the main point. But after that, I said, okay, well, this is a one-off idea. I can't keep doing this, and I'm certainly not going to make paintings and make a digital version of it. So I started thinking about, I became interested in like the idea that something low resolution looks really great on a monitor, looks great on a digital screen. So like pixelization, bit mapping, all these kind of like low tech digital reprinting kind of languages are really interesting to me. And I think it comes from my early interest of like creating a zine and going to Kinko's and like making like a punk rock zine that turned into a magazine later on. So I realized in GIFs that, GIFs kind of break down this image into this like pixelated image where all these beautiful patterns happen that the artist really doesn't have a control of. And so much of my work is about patterning and ornamentation and embellishment. And so I started creating these digital collages that look very similar to my paintings, but these digital collages never get made into paintings. They exist only digitally. And I started exploiting all these very basic Photoshop, ways of like breaking down images, reducing color, layering transparencies. And so they kind of, I guess, maybe you could call it glitch art, although I don't really think of myself as a glitch artist. But I started being able to create these new types of patterns that I couldn't make in paint, I couldn't replicate by hand. And I also like the idea that I would never print these. Like I'm not a big fan of selling prints of my NFTs. Like that's not something, or at least for now, the works that I'm making now, I want them to only be viewed on a monitor or in some digital capacity, because they're made specifically for that format. So I like the idea that they start on a computer, they end on a computer or on a monitor, and they're like truly like digitally native. Yeah.
I mean, a couple of things I'd like to dig into there. I remember, very early on acquiring a work from an artist and putting it in the museum, and then they reached out and said, "We never want this work to be shown in virtual reality." And I thought that was funny because it's very primitive, right? All of the work here is very primitive. There was nothing in this format that really came before that. So I kind of see your exploration of like the lo-fi, low res, reduction of the work to that as just like beginning to step in and explore what it means maybe to create primitives in this space.
Yeah, well, another thing I forgot to mention is that a lot of the way I create my paintings start on the computer. So I use a lot of found imagery from digital archives, whether they're museum databases that are digitized or public libraries, to Flickr and Instagram, to images that I just take with my phone. So I have these huge digital archives of thousands of images. And so when I make a new painting, I go and I kind of have an overarching theme or idea, and then I go and pull images from these archives, and then I start collaging them and manipulating them, adding them together, taking things away, adding elements. And those are usually the basis for my paintings. So all my paintings start digitally, but then I project that image and then I paint it, and it's a very analog process. So with this newer work, I thought, well, what if I don't do that and I actually start and end the entire process on the computer? So all the imagery is found online or digitized in some capacity, and then computer allows me to kind of move things around like a jigsaw puzzle until like they kind of snap together. And then I do, various layers of, I might take an image, make it black and white, color it digitally, then halftone it, then hand color it again, and then output it as a GIF. So it might go through like hundreds of these kind of process of like breaking down the image, adding detail to it, breaking it down again until essentially it just feels right.
Yeah, until you're satisfied.
Yeah.
Maybe we can talk more about. I want to try and put the words to it. Maybe it's object permanence. Is there something about the fact that there is the potential for these works, these actions, being on kind of decentralized ledgers to have perhaps an ongoing permanence that the paintings or the physical sculptures might not have?
I don't think I'm as interested in that so much. And also, to just point out, art has had a really good track record as far as like sticking around for, we have objects that are thousands and thousands of years old. So, I'd be happy if something sticks around for 100 years. I mean, I feel like that would be a success. Yeah, I mean, I'm all for that, but I guess that's not really the driving reason. I think it was like allowing me to explore a new medium, right? Allowing me to like tap into this new thing that was kind of experimental and just kind of learning by doing. And I also think of like my involvement with NFTs like similar to if I did like a ceramics residency somewhere. Like I love ceramics. I would love to go and just like immerse myself and make a body of work in ceramics at some point. And so I just think of this as like I'm doing this like a long-term residency, exploring digital art and just exploring a new material, a new medium. Although the residency hasn't ended yet, and maybe it won't end. It's become a big part of my work. And what's interesting is that the images that I'm making digitally are also influencing my paintings now, and the paintings are influencing the digital works. So again, just being a curious person, I feel like artists are explorers. They're curious. They want to experiment, and this is just a big part of that.
Yeah, I want to rewind a bit and talk more about kind of the relationship of the contemporary art world with NFTs. If you think collectors will continue to come over, if you think this was kind of a large speculative craze, and when you're speaking with them, what works and really what are they concerned with?
I've tried to onboard a lot of collectors into the space, and what I've surprisingly found out is that the collectors that collect physical work, for the most part, when they do come into the NFT space, they're more interested in the speculative nature of it. So they usually go towards the PFP side of things, which I have absolutely no interest in.
Right.
And I think that just has to do with like all the hype around the casino-like nature of, maybe not anymore, but what was 6 months ago. Yeah. So, I mean, I've talked extensively about NFTs with traditional collectors, and I think there's a couple of issues, right? So like one is that when you say NFT, it means like 500 different things, but everybody thinks it means one thing. So, you have NFT artists that make NFTs, but then you have companies that make NFTs. Then you have gambling NFT. There's so many things that fall under the NFT umbrella. Like I almost wish like the term crypto art or something else existed that could kind of describe the art side of things. Maybe it's just digital artists, but I think that's a really big barrier to entry for a lot of true art collectors that are interested in only art. They hear so much about Bored Apes and crypto punks or what have you, doodles, that they never end up hearing about all the interesting people that are actually making art. So I haven't found a successful way of really getting like a lot of them excited about it. I think it's just going to take a lot of time. I think the market being down is actually great for the art. You know, it took out a lot of people that were looky-loos. And who's left there? The people that are the real believers, both collectors and the artists. And it might be good if people aren't making, you know, $1 million for a JPEG. You know, like there's very few people that I think deserve that kind of money in the NFT space, let alone and in the art space. Like for me, you know, if the work is commanding that kind of price, that it means that it has to be like one of the most like forward-thinking, groundbreaking works of art. And I don't know if someone that's been working like for like 3 years is necessarily that. You know, it's hard to be a genius. You know,
and then I'll say capital rarely accrues to true genius in its time.
Yeah, and I think, you know, and I think we're also seeing a big, you know, like I think of myself as an advocate for other artists, and you know, one of the problems that we're going to start seeing is that a lot of these kind of like blue chip artists, they're going to have a very hard time replicating that kind of success moving forward. You know, a painter like Gerhard Richter, he's been selling works for millions of dollars for decades.
Yeah.
When he makes a new piece, there's a line out the door of people waiting to buy that work. I don't think you're going to get that kind of response with Beeple, right? He's probably never going to sell anything else for 69 million or even 30 million. You know, it's going to be hard to replicate that kind of success. And I think it's why you see a lot of these kind of bigger name artists. They're mostly quiet and they don't release a lot. Or if they do these massive editions because what they're hoping is to get, you know, a couple of $1,000s from a bunch of people instead of like a large sum from one person. Yeah. And that's unhealthy for an art market. You know, it doesn't necessarily build trust for other collectors. And that's another reason why I think these traditional collectors are so scared to come in and buy. You know, they want to know that if they buy something from an artist, it's going to at least be at the same price point, you know, in 10 years, not like crash, you know. And it's a big problem we have to solve. I don't know what the solution is in this space, but I think it's a big problem.
Yeah, I'll say, one, when people ask, you know, my definition of crypto art is really any creative that is looking to use cryptocurrency and blockchain to kind of increase their own sovereignty or to have direct market access, to have, you know, things that generally weren't afforded to all creators in the traditional art world. But that is, of course, the double-edged of sovereignty, right? You're in charge of your own marketing. You're in charge of finding your own collectors. You know, your collectors kind of do become your advocates, but I've seen it happen time and time again where people go on these meteoric rises and then there's nowhere left to go except for down.
Exactly.
And once you lose that momentum, it's really, really tough. And of course, like a lot of people also, they got caught up in the hype, trying to sell as much as quickly. They weren't patient or diligent with their practice. And then in retrospect, of course, they look, you know, kind of foolish. So, you know, I think there were a lot of lessons learned.
Yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of people manipulating markets. I mean, there's no other way to put it. There's a handful of collectors that were pumping, you know, 10 artists who were on super rare. And that's the other thing. It has a negative effect on the platforms too, you know, like in order for like a super rare great platform. I love all the people that work there, you know, but I saw they just laid off, you know, 30% of their staff. That's heartbreaking. And I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that, you know, they had this huge boom because, you know, 5 or 6 artists were just selling these insane price points. And how many of those, and it was mostly secondary market. And it's like, how many X copies can we sell in the secondary market in a year, or how many, whoever, right? It's not sustainable. It's a lot better to have, for super rare, to have 20 artists sell stuff for like $10,000 every day, right? Than to have one big sale once a month to like meet that bottom line. But I pay attention to the volume of a lot of these platforms, and for primary market works, it's not a lot. It's like 5 or 10 sales a day, and it's not again, it's just not sustainable, and
well, they were almost twice the